Herë përshëndetje, i nderuar ambasador Zoti Joachim Rücker, i nderuar rektori i Universitetit Prishtinës Hasan Prishtina, profesor Qerim Qerimi, të nderuar anëtar të Këshillit Drejtues Zoti Bezeraj, Zoti Krasniqi, profesor të Universitetit Prishtinës, prodekani i Fakultetit Filozofik, po ashtu prodekani Bea dhe prodekani Meri, të nderuar të pranishëm, të dashur kolegë student, mirë se erdhët në aktivitetin e radhës të cilën po organizon Departamenti i Historisë për nderë të 16 vjetorit të pavarësisë Kosovës. Për neve është një nderë që këtu të pranishëm ta kemi ish përfaqësuesin special të Sekretarit të Përgjithshëm të OKB-së në Kosovë në periudhën 2006-2008, zotin Joachim Rücker. Padyshim që edhe për këtë aktivitet duhet kemi kërkesë dhe iniciativë, e që për këtë janë përkujdesur studentët e Departamentit të Historisë, të cilët në kuadër të lëndës Historie e Kosovës, të cilën e ligjëron profesor Roli, do të thotë njëra ndër temat ka qenë edhe administrimi ndërkombëtar i Kosovës në periudhën 2000-2008. Së bashku me profesorin kemi vendosur që njërin nga protagonistët e asoj periudhe ta kemi sot ta ftojmë në fakt sot këtu për të qenë prezent së bashku me neve. Për të gjithë ata të cilët nuk e njohin ambasadorin Rücker ose kam pak një uri për të, më lejoni që në pikat e shkurta ta lexoj një biografi për ta prezantuar tek të tjerët ambasadorin Rücker. Zoti Joachim Rücker është doktor në fushën e ekonomisë, i diplomuar në Universitetin e Freiburgut, po ashtu është konsulent i pavarur dhe dikur ka shërbyer si ambasador i Gjermanisë. Gjatë karrierës së tij diplomatike, zoti Rücker ka qenë përfaqësues i përhershëm i UN-it në Gjenevë, president i Këshillit të OKB-së për të drejtat e njerëzit, përfaqësues special i Sekretarit të Përgjithshëm të OKB-së në Kosovë dhe inspektor i përgjithshëm i Ministrisë së Punëve të Jashtme në Gjermani. Duhet ta theksojmë se në Kosovë ka shërbyer në dy periudha. Në fazën e parë të shërbimit të tij, zoti Rücker ishte përgjegjës për ndërtimin ekonomik të vendit, ku krijoi programe gjithëpërfshirëse për privatizim dhe ristrukturimin e ndërmarrjeve publike, ndihmoi në vendosjen e themeleve për një ekonomi tregu funksionale, duke përfshirë krijimin e parqeve industriale si dhe zonave të veçanta ekonomike. Zoti Rücker, ndër të tjera, ka të botuar edhe librin Standardet dhe statusi, si u bë Kosova e pavarur, që është libër në gjuhën angleze, e që ne shpresojmë që të përkthehet edhe në gjuhën shqipe dhe bibliotekat e Universitetit të Prishtinës po ashtu të pajisen me këtë libër jashtëzakonisht të rëndësishëm për historinë e vendit tonë. Zoti Rücker ka dhënë një kontribut të jashtëzakonshëm për shtetëndërtimin dhe shtetëformimin e Kosovës, andaj në emër të Departamentit të Historisë, po ashtu në emër të gjithë studentëve të këtij departamenti, dëshiroj ta falenderoj thellësisht për kontributin e tij për formimin e shtetit të Kosovës. Pa dashur të zgjatem shumë, fjalën ja kisha kalu ambasadorit Joachim Rücker për një ligjëratë, do të thotë, pastaj do të vazhdojmë me sesionin e pyetjeve dhe përgjigjeve. Mr. Rücker?
Thank you. Mërdita, është nderë të jemi ju, sot. I continue in English though. And I understand that most people, if not everybody, speaks English. And if not, you interrupt me and say you want a translation. And we'll have a translation. I'm very honored to be here. I thank in particular the rector, dean, members of the faculty of history and other faculties for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the role of UNMIK and myself in the decisive period. Well, actually, I was here for 3.5 years, from 2005 to 2008. I stayed until 4 months after the Declaration of Independence, which was exactly the Ahtisaari period for the SRSG to stay after 4 months. Here she goes, and I went after 4 months. But I will start with some of the elements from my book. As you kindly mentioned, I have written a book back in 2010-11 about my time, and it's called Standards and Status, how Kosovo became independent, because there was this process that was called the standards process, and of course all my partners and friends will remember that period. I also wanted to say in the beginning how closely I worked, especially with Minister Bujar Dugoli when he was still a minister for the economy, for economic affairs. We worked together in many functions. First, when I was a deputy SRSG, responsible for the economic reconstruction, and we did privatization together and other things, and we tried to fix the energy problems here. But also later, when I became the special representative of the Secretary General, SRSG, and head of UNMIK, we still work closely with Bujar and the whole government. You invited me to talk about the role of the United Nations, and in particular the role of the UN mission here in Kosovo. But maybe we go on a meta level for a second and talk about the role of the United Nations in today's world. Now, today, many people are not aware anymore about the basic functions of the United Nations as enshrined in the Charter. The Charter of the United Nations basically gives the United Nations three main tasks. The surveillance of peace and security with the Security Council, the promotion of sustainable development with the General Assembly and the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, and others, and the protection and promotion of human rights, especially with the Human Rights Council in Geneva since 2006. And with all these three main pillars of the UN system, we have seen successes and disappointments in the last years, but I would like to encourage you to say that the UN is maybe not a failure, but quite an asset with regard to being an anchor in the international, in the world order, in the rule-based legal world order. Maybe with regard to peace and security, that's not so obvious, because we have seen many cases where the Security Council that is concerned with peace and security is not functional. It's blocked by a Russian veto or something. It's just not working as it should. And some conflicts are not resolved. But when you look at other pillars of the UN system, we have seen quite some progress with, for example, with regard to sustainable development, climate action, protecting diversity, protecting the oceans. We have seen remarkable international agreements under the umbrella of the UN in the last years that nobody would have expected, especially the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015, where everybody pledged to the 1.5 degree goal. That was not expected from the UN, and it came from the UN. It was under, and it is under the UN umbrella. Also, with regard to human rights, we don't have so much progress maybe on implementation in certain countries, but we certainly have instruments, and we have a very remarkable body of law, of international law that protects and promotes human rights. So I guess what I'm saying is that don't underestimate the UN. They are still the anchor of the rule-based international order. And I think in 1999, we also had a moment after NATO's intervention here in the conflict and Serbia's suppression and actually almost attempted genocide with regard to Kosovo Albanians. We had this moment where the UN Security Council was actually functioning, and it passed the famous resolution 1244, UN Security Council resolution 1244, which made it clear that the UN has now, in 1999, back in 1999, ownership of the conflict that was still ongoing. And this Security Council resolution 1244 was, of course, passed in the Security Council immediately after NATO's intervention in the former Yugoslavia in order to stop Milosevic's brutal oppression and expulsion of the Kosovo Albanians, and it has been adopted on 10th June 1999, one day after the Yugoslav Federal Army had signed the so-called military technical agreement. There is an echo somewhere. Yep. Yeah, we'll manage. The military technical agreement with NATO in Kumanovo, and withdrew completely from Kosovo. The Yugoslav army completely withdrew. And then the UN Security Council said, now we need to take a hold need to get a grip on the situation, and they passed Security Council Resolution 1244, and they said there will be an interim administrator now for Kosovo from the UN, a krye-administrator, and they defined the duties of the UNMIK and the head administrator for an interim period of time. That's very important for you to know. For an interim period of time until a final political status for Kosovo was decided. It didn't say how this final political status was going to be decided. It just said for an interim period there will be an international administration under an SRSG, a special representative of the Secretary General and head of UNMIK. And this resolution gave UNMIK very important responsibilities. I will just mention 3 different ones because I think they're the most important ones, but there's a whole list of responsibilities. The first responsibility was to administer Kosovo, including maintaining law and order, and at the same time to establish provisional institutions of self-government and transferring administrative responsibilities to these institutions of self-government. They were called PISG, Provisional Institutions of Self-Government, and it was the governance role or the administrative role of the SRSG. The second responsibility, very important from 1244, is to support peacekeeping and peace-building activities with all the communities. It was a peacekeeping role because we were a peacekeeping mission from the UN, meaning that there should be no riots, no harassment of minorities, and there should be general civilized process in that interim period. And the third responsibility was to facilitate the process of determining Kosovo's final political status. Now, I tried to explain what political status is. Political status is what you now call the independence that came from the Declaration of Independence on 17th February 2008. However, at that time, we didn't have the horizon what the final political status would be. The resolution 1244 doesn't say what it is, but they charged the SRSG with facilitating it. So they basically said, the SRSG is responsible for administering Kosovo, for keeping peace, and for facilitating a process to the final political status. Okay, that is a threefold mandate, and it was quite huge and complex, and the complexity of this mandate led to the fact that UN mission in Kosovo became the largest civilian peacekeeping mission in UN history. There was never a larger, because we had all these administration tasks. So we were the largest peacekeeping mission in UN history, civilian, not military. And when I started to serve as the Special Representative of Secretary General, head of UNMIK, on 1st September 2006, there were still some 6,000 UN staff under UNMIK, international and local, including some 2,000 UNMIK police officers, international judges and prosecutors. Then the staff from the OSCE mission in Kosovo, which represented UNMIK's Pillar 3. UNMIK's work was divided in pillars for democratic institution building, organizing elections, organizing all the democratic institutions, including helping to build parliament from the scratch, etc. And there was still the Pillar 4 for economic reconstruction. Formerly there have been Pillars 1 and 2, but when I became the head of UNMIC, that was already integrated into the office of the SRSG. Now, the public expectation was, on 1st September 2006, that I would more be a manager, because there was a process, a status process going on already with the United Nations charging Mati Ahtisaari, an international negotiator, with finding a political status, negotiating with Serbia, negotiating with Kosovo, and finding a political status. And then the resolution 1244 would be taken back by the Security Council, and a new resolution would come. And basically, well, the expectation was to say Kosovo is now independent, and that's it. So when I started, it was more sort of this expectation: this is a managerial job, and it will be maybe less of a political job because everything is on track. However, as it turned out, it wasn't really on track as we thought. But nevertheless, we started in 2006, we started planning for a final transition to a final authority under a new status. So we started internally in UNMIC a complex project management scheme which we structured in 5 different sections: how we would transit the current constitution, which was a so-called constitutional framework from, I think, 2001, how we would manage the security transition, how we would manage the legal transition, very important, because we had different layers of laws that were actually valid. We had laws from former Yugoslav times, we had UNMIC regulations, and we had administrative directives and executive decisions, and all of this had to be transferred to a potential new government. Then we had a technical transition: civil administration, property and economy, rule of law, governance, etc. And we had other issues like administration of state property, handover of archives, etc. All that was prepared without an Ahtisaari plan or a final status plan on the table. We were prudent in the sense that we tried to prepare for ultimate status events. We didn't want to be caught unaware of what would be expected of us. Now, this transition planning and implementation, as we called it, was going on. It was a priority for the mission. I also tried to make sure that another process was ongoing, which was called the Standards for Kosovo process. This was started in 2002, and it was a set of standards that was established in order to measure Kosovo's progress towards the start of a process that would lead to a final political status. And the so-called standards process was about 8 fields that were identified as functioning democratic institutions, rule of law, freedom of movement, sustainable returns for refugees, and also internally displaced people, and the rights of communities and their members, economy, property rights, etc., etc. And every 3 months, a progress report on the implementation of these standards was which was called the Technical Assessment of Standards Implementation, was a regular attachment to the quarterly reports to the Secretary General. We wrote quarterly reports to the Secretary General from our mission, and those were discussed in the Security Council, and I would usually go to New York to the Security Council and present the quarterly report on the progress of Kosovo on its road to what would hopefully then lead to a status process. And it was called and one important element was the technical assessment of standards implementation. Now, when it came to how we organized this measuring of the technical progress on standards in these fields, We had working groups. I think you were a part of working groups. Every minister was basically in working groups. And there was also a group from the international side that was there in all the meetings, basically, for measuring the progress. That was the contact group. I'm sure you have heard of the contact group as an important international group. It was basically, and is still today, well, no, not today, but it was the link between the Security Council politically and what's happening on the ground. And the contact group originally consisted of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Russia, and the US. In the contact group plus format also with the EU. So you had contact group or contact group plus, and they were engaged in the status process. Russia was at that time still a part of the process because they had also passed the resolution 1244 in 1999. They were in the contact group because the feeling was you need Russia on board, and they were still in the contact group, and they were also present at the meetings of the standard technical assessment. When it came to this reporting, when I took office, after a couple of months, I became pretty convinced that with regard to the technical standard implementation, UNMIC, together with the PISG, the Provisional Institutions of Self-Government, we have reached what was possible under the circumstances. And this was a phrase I coined at the time, and it made it into the reports to New York. It was presented also in the Security Council. I kept saying that I think that UNMIC had largely achieved what was achievable under the circumstances, and further progress would depend on solving the status issue. Zooming slightly back on May 2005, there was a sort of an important step on the way to a mechanism to resolve the status issue. There was a report on the standards implementation status by a Norwegian ambassador Eide, and he came to the conclusion that, well, actually now you can start the status process, and the Secretary General, based on this assessment that UNMIC has achieved what is achievable, and maybe also the PISG had achieved what is achievable, the Secretary General in New York came to the conclusion that now something needed to be done in order to facilitate and promote a status process. So what did he do? The Secretary General of the United Nations appointed Matti Ahtisaari, the former president of Finland, as his special envoy for the future status process for Kosovo, together with an Austrian, Mr. Albert Rohan. On 10th November 2005, the Security Council supported their appointment. During that time, Kosovo's leaders also met, at that time still in President Rugova's house in Pristina, and discussed their plans. And they formed what has been called the Team of Unity, because they were clear that now they needed a united Kosovo appearance when it came to negotiations under the facilitator Ahtisaari. And it was at that time, the first Team of Unity was President Rugova, Prime Minister Kusumi, Parliamentary Speaker Neshatadze, Hashim Thaçi, Vetan Suray, Blerim Shala, to name the core team. That changed, of course, when prime ministers and presidents changed, but that was the Team of Unity. And then Ahtisaari started to meet with these teams, with the teams from Serbia, with the team from Kosovo, and he has developed his proposal, which I will be talking about in a second. Now that was, of course, quite difficult for him, and he could not always use the format where everybody's sitting at the same table, because it was sometimes very difficult to meet at the same table for obvious reasons. So he also used other formats like proximity formats, where one group would sit in this room and the other group would sit in that room. And he or his team, they would go in between the rooms and said, no, Serbia has just said that blah, blah, blah. And then he would go there and say, okay, is that acceptable to you? And the other way around. So they used many different formats. However, at the end of the process, Ahtisaari came up with a proposal. Maybe it's important also to memorize that the contact group had actually issued guiding principles for the process. So there were some, let's say, some principles that Ahtisaari and the two teams from Belgrade and from Pristina had to be guided by. And those were the famous 3 no's that actually the contact group has established very early, and notably with Russia. No return to the pre-1999 situation, no partition of Kosovo, that's the second one, and no union with any other country. And there was actually a 4th no that came at the London meeting of the contact group in January 2006, where they said that no settlement can be agreed that is not agreeable to the people of Kosovo. So we call that a 4th no. It needs to be agreeable to the people of Kosovo, whatever that meant, but I think it's pretty clear. So Ahtisaari went on and negotiated, and that was difficult enough, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. But about a year later, Ahtisaari was finished. That was in early 2007. And he traveled to Pristina and to Belgrade in early February 2007. And now the public became aware that the Ahtisaari proposal actually had 2 elements. The one element was called the Comprehensive Proposal for the Kosovo Status Settlement, and that was, if you so wish, it was more technical. And then there is the second package was more political. The more technical comprehensive proposal was about minority rights, the rights of the Serbian minority and other minority. It was about decentralization, which meant redrawing of some local boundaries combined with a high degree of local self-governance for especially the Serbian minority, which is still today's issue for you when you talk about the famous Association of Majority Serb Municipalities. I think it's still an unresolved thing, but it's in the Ahtisaari package. It's about religious and cultural heritage. It's about economic and property issues. It's about security, including the creation of a Kosovo security force and the dissolution of the Kosovo Protection Corps and other matters. This was the first package, the comprehensive proposal. Part 2 was, as I said, more political of the Ahtisaari proposal, and it was the headline was "Report of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Kosovo's Future Status." He was the special envoy, I was the special representative of the Secretary General. Slight differences, but he was to conduct the status process, and I was there to facilitate the status process. That was the more political part, and that contained the actual status proposal, and in an annex it contained the main provisions of the comprehensive proposal. So that was the whole Ahtisaari package, and as you know that in part 2, I'm sure you know, Ahtisaari proposed a supervised independence, where for the time being, after the declaration of independence, after the independence, an international civilian representative would still oversee things for a certain time. So that was his proposal, a supervised independence. And that was then sent to the Security Council on 26 March 2007. And also it became fully public in Kosovo and in Serbia and elsewhere at the time. Now, with regard to UNMIK, Ahtisaari proposed that they leave after a 4 months transition period after the independence, where for 4 months they would still have their competencies, but then they would hand over. And talking about handing over, we already had planned for handing over. You remember I talked before about our transition planning implementation, so we were ready to hand over to whatever comes. We had prepared for this as UNMIK. However, it wasn't so easy. First of all, it wasn't so easy. I'm not talking about the Security Council yet. I'm talking about the domestic situation in Kosovo and the domestic situation in Serbia. Serbia didn't like it because they didn't like the independence thing in it. And there was also resistance in Kosovo that, you know, people said, well, we expected more, and what is that, a supervised independence, we want full independence, etc., etc. So I think what Ahtisaari did was trying to propose a carefully thought of and balanced proposal, which had as a core the independence, but not everybody was happy. So what we had to do as UNMIK, together with our partners from the Kosovo provincial institutions of government, our ministers, prime minister, president, we would go out and explain the Ahtisaari proposal to a wider public. We have had many, many town hall meetings at the time where we explained how it would work. What was particularly difficult was to explain the decentralization element, the sort of the you know, that you would give more local governance competencies to the majority served municipalities, whether it's in the north or whether in Gračanica or Stripce or whatever, but that was met with a degree of skepticism, let's put it that way, and we went out and tried to explain the proposal as it was done. However, that was the domestic thing, and when Serbia rejected it, the Kosovo public, I think that's my impression, maybe it was different, but my impression was that Kosovo warmed up to it the more Serbia rejected it. They didn't like it because it had independence, and in Kosovo there was an increasing, I felt, an increasing sentiment that Ahtisaari proposal is actually a good proposal at the right time. But then came the moment where it was presented in the Security Council, and that was on 3rd of April 2007. The Secretary General said, this is it now, and he went to the Security Council and said, please, Security Council, this is about peace and security in Southeastern Europe, in the Western Balkans. Why don't you approve that? And then the idea was 1244, the resolution would be you know, withdrawn, and the new resolution would say, okay, now that's it. That's a new phase. But it didn't really work that way because it became very clear that Russia didn't like the whole thing anymore. And instigated by Serbia probably, because Serbia also said no, Russia said no already in the Security Council, that they didn't like it, they wanted more time, etc. They did what you usually do when you don't like something, you ask for more time. And on 3rd of April 2007, actually for the first time, initially President Sediu was invited to present Kosovo's case with regard to the Ahtisaari proposal. At the last minute, it turned out that the Russians insisted that he would not speak himself, but only the SRSG, which is me. So I, like, let's say in the past, so to speak. So I had to go, and I was in first row of Security Council, Fatmir Sediu was in second row, and I was irritated about the fact that they didn't want him to speak because I had no mandate on the status, on the political status. That's not my mandate in 1244. So I was a bit irritated. So what I did is I read Fatmir's speech. So he sat behind me, and I said, okay, what should have been happening here is that Fatmir Sediu was supposed to speak. He's sitting behind me. Apparently he's not allowed to speak, so I'm reading his speech now. That's what I did in the Security Council. So his messages were conveyed after all, and I think that was an interesting move. However, some people called this my ventriloquist act or whatever, but at that time it became clear that especially the Russians didn't want to move, so the Security Council decided to come here. In April 2007, they said, well, we want to look. We want to see the situation. We want to understand for ourselves how this looks in Kosovo, and we want to listen to people, and then we make up our mind. And that's a request you cannot deny. So the Secretary General arranged, together with the chairperson of the Security Council, for a visit here. And President Fatmir Sediu and Prime Minister, I think, Joachim Rücker at the time, and myself, we arranged for the visit. They were here for 3 days. We showed them every corner of Kosovo almost. We treated them nicely. We also confronted them with many witnesses and victims of the terrible times in the 1990s. But we also had people from the Serbian community speak out on their perceptions of the Serbian minority. But we also went to Kušavoge together and let the victims speak and Security Council listen. And they have been very attentive. And then they went back to New York, but it didn't solve the problem. So it became increasingly clear that the Ahtisaari plan would not be approved by the Security Council. And then all agreed that there would be a very, very last chance to try for an agreement of both Serbia and Kosovo on the Ahtisaari plan by an international troika, representatives from the EU, from the US, and from Russia. And they tried for several months. Basically from July, August 2007 until December 2007 to, as they said, turn every stone, leave no stone unturned in order to get the Ahtisaari plan approved. However, it did not work. And Serbia said no, Russia said no, and here we were. And that was the first time where publicly the contact group fell apart. There was Russia, and there was the other members of the contact group, the Quint, meaning Germany, Britain, France, and the US and the EU, etc., with a different agenda. And that is also the time when people here thought increasingly, well, if the Ahtisaari plan doesn't work, we need to do something else. And how about a unilateral declaration of independence? And in the past, the UN, the UNMIK SRSG, the head of UNMIK, experienced a couple of unilateral declarations of independence from the Kosovo side, and they struck it down because they said it's not in line with Resolution 1244 as we interpret it in the UN. So my concern was already very early, even during the Ahtisaari process and before, that if there is ever something like a unilateral declaration of independence, it should be legally very, very well prepared, meaning that it cannot bypass the United Nations. You cannot have a declaration of independence. That was my opinion, at least, and that was shared by many actors at the time. You cannot just say, forget 1244, forget the UN, do what you want. That would never work because we have an international legal order and the UN is its guarantor and UNMIK had a mandate. But what you could do is you could interpret Resolution 1244 in a different way that it has been interpreted before. And if you looked at Resolution 1244 very closely, it actually didn't prescribe a way to independence or to a final political status. It was totally silent on how the final political status came about. And all the competencies of the SRSG, of UNMIK, were interim competencies. Now, if you look closely at the resolution, which you can because you're history students, then you will see that in Article 11F of 1244, there is a reference to the final political status and to the transition to the final political status. And in that transition period, all the competencies of the interim period would practically go away, and you would have a different phase of UNMIK's presence. At least that was an interpretation that was increasingly upheld by a number of member states, developed and upheld by a number of member states, and it was in my view, the very thing that allowed the United Nations in the end, after 17th February 2008, to say we're neutral. Because if one group of member states is interpreting 1244 in this way, Russia, Serbia, and others, and another group of member states is interpreting 1244 in that way, then the UN can stay neutral. And that concept was developed by some people before 17th February 2008. And I think it allowed then the Secretary General to say, we are status neutral as a UN. I don't know what time it is. No, I should probably go to Q&A now. I stayed for another four months after the Declaration of Independence. So as you can see also in the Declaration and later in the Constitution, it's all built on the Ahtisaari Plan, knowing that the Ahtisaari Plan was not adopted in the Security Council, but instead the Kosovo people, the Kosovo Assembly, the Kosovo government said we will build our independence on the Ahtisaari Plan because it was a good plan. So also when I left, international civilian representative came, Peter Veit, and there was a sort of a supervised independence for a while, as everything as foreseen in the Ahtisaari Plan. Now when you ask me, is the Ahtisaari Plan implemented now fully? The answer is no. Because some elements are missing, and the most important point is, of course, the relations between Serbia and Kosovo are not normalized yet, and that is the big challenge. I think both sides have obligations under the Ahtisaari Plan. Both sides need to move, and the EU is very clear that nobody will get into the EU if there is unresolved recognition and territorial issues. So Serbia will not get into the EU if they don't recognize Kosovo in one way or another. We can talk about forms of recognition. And Kosovo also has to move to a certain degree. We still don't have an association of majority Serb municipalities. I know that the Constitutional Court said something in 2016 which has to be respected. That's all clear. But at the end of the day, this also has to happen in order for the Ahtisaari Plan to be fully implemented and lead to EU integration of both Kosovo and Serbia. And that's my hope, that this will happen. And I was maybe not as detailed as I wanted to be, but I think that was the basic story of the years between 2005 and 2008 when I was here. Thank you so much for listening. We can go to Q&A. Yeah, why not? Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rücker. It's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for sharing these details for our students. This is very important for us to know these details about you. Po valim të sistemi pyetjeve dhe përgjigjeve, kështu që nëse keni ndonjë pyetje që dëshironi t'ia adresoni ambasadorit Rücker.
First, let me introduce myself. I'm Ilman Bishi, in Kosovan student in master degree in the history of New Era 5, and I would like to know why we have two liaison office of two of the countries in the Security Council in United Nations, which doesn't recognize the independence of Kosovo, like Russia or China. I'm more interested.
I think I'll stand.
China liaison
It's better.
office. Chinese liaison office here in Kosovo. We don't have formal relations. For example, there is a program on education, supporting of education in Kosovo from China, or environmental cooperation, economic, cultural, no one, but still exists here in Prishtina one Chinese liaison office. But at the same time, we have many other countries from United Nations which doesn't recognize the independence of Kosovo, like Brazil, which has maintained her state in with Kosovo relation, and yet we don't have a Brazilian liaison office. Why should we have a Chinese liaison office here in Kosovo, which we don't have any formal relation, despite the fact that here in Western Balkans we are seeing a huge Shiite with our neighbor countries like Serbia and very strong Chinese economic presence in Albania. That doesn't mean that there are Chinese everywhere around here, but the relations are yet the same.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the more offices and embassies you have here, the better. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with the Chinese liaison office, even if they didn't recognize. I would, I've also been I'm a former diplomat. I think every capital is blessed with as many as possible liaison offices and embassies. It's a different question if you sort of like politics of the state that's represented, but I would separate that. I would say, okay, it's good that we have some sort of relations with China and they have a liaison office and you should respect them and you should talk to them and you should invite them for your, I don't know, receptions or whatever. And then, you know, eventually they will learn that maybe it might be a good idea to recognize Kosovo, I don't know. But I would not criticize at all sort of and of course if you have recognizing countries that are not represented, then you should try to invite them and induce them to come. But I don't see that as a conflict. It's just a matter of life. Some people have a liaison because China is relatively rich, so they have a liaison office, and others, maybe Brazil will come eventually, and you should encourage Brazil to come.
Okay. Pyetja tjetër? Hajde.
First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Shkodran Kasuman, in the last year of my studies in bachelor degree in the Department of History. I would be short. Just how do you rate the cooperation, your cooperation with the politicians of Kosovo during your mandate you served in Kosovo?
Well, I think we had a relationship of mutual respect. We had different roles. I had a role, and I think I've described that role with the three-dimension governance role, peacekeeping role, facilitation of status role. And my counterparts from the provisional institutions of self-governance, from the Kosovo government, had their roles. And we respected those roles, and we, I think, agreed on many things. And if we disagreed, we sometimes had agreements to disagree. That's a nice instrument, you know. You can still be friendly if you disagree. I remember many, not with Puja so much, but with your distinguished colleague Ethem Čeko, we had some difficulties in managing the energy sector, and then we had some agreements to disagree. That wasn't personal. That was, but we had different opinions, but it was, at least I can say that from my side, it was always respectful.
Edhe dy pyetje për morëm të shkaktues. Hajde Blart edhe hajde Odessa. Hajde Blart.
Alright, so my name is Blart Flashi. I'm also a student in my third year of bachelor's in the Department of History. My question is a bit superficial, but I'd like to ask, where were you and how did you react to Kosovo gaining its independence back in 2008?
Okay, I was not in the parliament where the actual act took place. Why? Because I had done what I have in broad strikes, I think, already said before. I had reported to New York what's going to happen. That's my duty as the head of the mission. And I said, I think this is going to happen now. I think we should stay neutral because, you know, like one group of member states is saying this and the other is saying that. And then my instructions came from New York and said, okay, we stay neutral, but if we stay neutral, you cannot go to the parliament because then you're not neutral anymore. So I didn't go. But I went to the brasseries and to the cafes in the evening and to the...
Okay, the last one.
First of all, I want to say it's very nice to meet you, Mr. Rücker. We are very honored with your presence here.
Same here.
My question for you is, what were the difficulties in your preparation with politicians of Kosovo during the time?
Preparations for?
preparation for the mission on the eve of the independence of Kosovo?
For me personally, how I prepared for my job. Okay, I had been deputy head of mission for 1.5 years. I was head of Unmixed Pillar 4. So I was already part of the executive committee, the small executive committee of Unmixed. So I knew what was going on. I worked closely with my predecessor as SRSG, the Søren Jessen Petersen from Denmark. So I was prepared, I think. I didn't know I was going to be the SRSG later, but that's what New York decided. Also, I have been in a number of executive positions before, or responsible, also in the Balkans. I was deputy high representative in Bosnia in 2001 and 2002. I have been the mayor of a German industrial city, so I knew what governance and local governance is all about. So I had collected, and of course in diplomatic positions I've collected some, but nevertheless, I mean, I guess what I want to say is you cannot prepare enough for that position because there's always surprises.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Very well. There's one more gentleman.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Hasan Prishtina. I study political science at the last year now bachelor. I wanted to ask you as a formal diplomat, how do you see the situation now in Kosovo, especially after we have been, I can say, clearly attacked from Serbia and still we are getting sanctions? Like, I know that in international justice it's very hard to get the real justice, I think, especially that I am a citizen of a country that didn't have visa for so long and we felt very discriminated by that. But so far, how do you think now we as a government or like a country, how should we react to tell the world that we should not be sanctioned at all? Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, I think when you look at what we would call maybe we look at the last 12 months and everything that has happened in the north. Some things were maybe legal, but maybe not politically super wise. So, you know, I think Kosovo needs to keep talking to its friends. And there is a close connection between your friends in the EU and in the Quint, and I think Kosovo should actually use these connections and consult on steps. What you call sanctions, I would call requests from the EU regarding the elections in the north. I think they can be met. These requests can be met. They're not really very big requests. I think they're maybe a bit something I would call common sense. But so I wouldn't criticize that too much. But yeah, I think you will overcome that step very quickly. I think the general direction has to be clear, and the general direction is that I would recommend that Kosovo institutions keep being in close contact with their friends and allies. Thank you. Yeah? Okay.
Ja, fjallën rektorit të Universitetit Prishtinës Hasan Prishtina, Sekretarit Qerim Qerimi. Profesor.
Yeah, sure.
Most of students speak English.
Yes,
so.
absolutely. No, I saw that. Yeah.
Mr. Rücker, nderuar prag, nderuar anëtarë të Këshillit Drejtues të Universitetit, nderuar prodekan, nderuar profesor Vjar, kolegë, miq, mysafir, dashur student. Mr. Rücker did not find in Kosovo, I think, think, the dark hole that was projected for him. But he decided to see it with his own eyes, and I will say glasses too. And through his eyes, the world recognized a different Kosovo. Again, perhaps not so prosperous and developed, but with a lot of potential and will of its youth and its people. Because as he himself declared, one must aim for the impossible to achieve the possible. And this is what Kosovo did during his administration and beyond. And this is what we are doing today, and we will do tomorrow. During Mr. Rücker's leadership, Kosovo was at the most important turning point in its history. I think it is an understatement to say that his role on the big stage of politics in 2006 and 2008 was genuine art, the art of measured action and patient inaction. This moment was of critical importance when Kosovo declared its independence, and when this declaration was legally assessed by the International Court of Justice. And so I recall especially two relevant passages from the decision of the World Court. One, and I quote, "The reaction of the Special Representative of the Secretary General to the Declaration of Independence is of significance," end of quote. And two, and I quote again, "The silence of the Special Representative of the Secretary General in the face of the Declaration of Independence of 17 February 2008 suggests that he did not consider that the declaration was an act of the provisional institutions of self-government designed to take effect within the legal order for the supervision of which he was responsible," end of quote. And we were obviously, being later on part or a member of and coordinator of Kosovo's legal team before the ICJ in these proceedings, we couldn't be happier with your action by inaction. And so that was absolutely critical. And so thank you so much for your silent, salient, dignified and diplomatic attitude when we needed it most during the period when the representatives of the people of Kosovo were proclaiming their independence to the world. Then another moment in March 2007, the UN Security Council, at the UN Security Council, a lot was said about Kosovo. But especially two statements echoed the room. One, the people deserve clarity on status, and two, the people need clarity on status. I think it is no secret that the UN administrators were met with mixed feelings among Kosovar people and their political representatives, as it was somehow indicated from the questions and responses here. But it is candidly recognized that Mr. Rücker was among the most respected personalities from the international community we hosted in Kosovo. This warm-hearted German from Baden-Württemberg with a doctorate on international economics who recognized the economic and international potential of Kosovo. And on behalf of, for these reasons, and on behalf of the university, it is my very distinct privilege to bestow on you a distinct certificate of appreciation with the following motivation. And I read it here: for his memorable and lasting contributions to building institutions and democracy before, during, and after the Declaration of Independence of Kosovo. And I'll read it in Albanian as well. Certifikata e nderimit për Zotin Rücker për mbarë motivacionin si ndërim, për kontributin e tij të paharrueshëm e të shndrueshëm në ndërtimin e institucioneve dhe demokracisë para gjatë e pas shpalljes së pavarësisë Kosovës. Thank you all very much. So,
oh, nice.
You can see it
Thank
yourself.
you so much.
If there are any mistakes, we'd be happy to correct.
No, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
So it's the same motivation that I just read it, and I hope you're happy with that.
I'm absolutely happy. I'm very honored, very honored.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rücker. Shumë faleminderit. Thank you so much.
Përshfrytëzoj rastin që këtë takim ta shpollet të mbyllur dhe në njëjtën kohë të gjithë jeni të ftuar për një koktejl rasti që të organizohet në katin e tretë. Faleminderit shumë.
Great.